This week on Quadriga, Erdogan's election victory. Mandate for an autocrat? It wasn't what pollsters predicted. A clear victory for Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, whose AKP party won an absolute majority in parliament. The question is, will the president now tighten his control over Turkish politics even further? The election was marred by violence and intimidation. For months now, the government has been cracking down on opposition activists and journalists. The peace process with the Kurds has been shattered. Divisions have deepened in the wake of deadly bomb blasts. Has Erdogan profited from chaos he deliberately created, as critics say? Do Turks really want an autocrat at the helm? Quadriga, the international debate. Your host, Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome. What accounts for an election result that surprised even the AK party's own pollsters? And what's next in Turkey? That's what we want to talk about today with three people who are following the situation very closely there. It's a pleasure to welcome Judy Dempsey. She's a longtime columnist for the International Herald Tribune, now a senior researcher at Carnegie Europe and the editor-in-chief of Strategic Europe. And she says it's a mandate that could move Turkey away from Europe or toward Europe. It's one or the other. And it's a pleasure to welcome Dilek Kurban. She was born and raised in Turkey. She is now a senior research fellow at the Hertie School of Governance here in Berlin. She's published on the Kurdish question, human rights and media freedom in Turkey. She says Turkish society missed an opportunity for democracy and the rule of law with yet another AK party single-party rule. And finally, we're very pleased to have back on the show Alan Posener. He's a political author at the German daily Die Welt, and he says Erdogan has no mandate to change the constitution, but he is the legitimate leader of the strongest Islamic country in the region, and therefore he is our most important partner. So a warm welcome to all of you. Dilek Kurban, it's just 5 months since the AK party lost its absolute majority in parliament. What accounts for this extraordinary comeback?
Multiple factors. One is the inability of all political parties after the elections to form a coalition government for various reasons, which arouse a fear in the general population that this might lead to similar results in snap elections, could lead to a similar outcome, which means political instability, which would lead to economic instability. And also during the 5 months, there's been an increasing violence and war, basically, in the Kurdish region. That also sort of scared people that in the absence of a strong government, things could rapidly deteriorate, which would have implications for people's, lives. So I would say the biggest factor was fear of instability and fear of rapid decline in the economy, rise in inflation, etc. So in the end, people, like in many countries perhaps, thought of their own personal interests and went for a more predictable future rather than taking the risk of voting for someone else.
But Judy Dempsey, isn't Mr. Erdogan stoking the very violence and fear that drove voters into the arms of his party?
Absolutely, and I just pick up on what Dilek was saying. A predictable future, is it that predictable? The AKP, Erdogan's party, won through actually censoring the media, harassing journalists, fomenting violence, and actually creating an atmosphere of instability where now he says, I'm the one that can create stability. This is a very, it's a victory that doesn't actually guarantee stability. And remember, what does stability mean?
I want to come right back to stability, but Alan Posener, Judy Dempsey has just said the election absolutely was not fair, but election observers who were there on voting day did not report many observable irregularities.
No, I think the OECD said it was a free election, but not a fair election.
Yeah.
So Judy is quite right there. There was a measure of people being really terrorised. I mean, a TV station shut down while it was on the air and stuff like that. So it was a free election. It wasn't fair. And I agree also that it doesn't bode well for stability because we know that autocrats are never stable. So there's a problem here, no question.
Dilek Kurban, what is the situation of the media in your country? Tell us a bit about the picture there.
Well, I mean, media in Turkey has structural problems which predate this government, which have deteriorated rapidly in the past few years. The main issue is, of course, that there are conglomerates, there are holdings that own media companies, owned by people, individuals of various political leanings or economic interests, and this makes them susceptible to government future because these are companies that have vested interest in working with the government. So the media has never really been independent or impartial, but things are getting worse because now the government has been very actively attacking the media in very novel ways. Some of which include that in the past 5 years or so, very sort of Putinesque tactics such as using the tax law or social security law, etc. But very recently, going even beyond that and completely in an unlawful manner taking over media companies, etc. And I should also just point out, to avoid a misunderstanding, it is not my perception that an AKP single-party rule will bring stability. It's just in analyzing why people voted for that, I think for many people, that's what they believed in, that a single party would suggest stability.
Alan Posener, things for a while were actually looking pretty problematic for Mr. Erdogan. If we think back to the revelations about his family being implicated in corruption scandals, the Gezi Park protests, the weakening economy, what happened?
Difficult to say, really. I mean, I wouldn't have put my money on Erdogan 6 months ago, but there you have it. He managed to survive all that. That's quite incredible. It's a political feat. And he did it, of course, in part by semi-legal means, by transferring prosecutors who were on the case against his family to somewhere else, by intimidating journalists who were investigating his family, and as far as the Gezi Park was concerned, by simple, police brutality, quite frankly. So, but, in a more democratic society than Turkey, unfortunately, is, he wouldn't have survived. He did. Have to hand it to him.
Can I pick you up on this, if I may? I mean, remember the big mining accident. Yeah. I find Turkey is very, very interesting. We have time and again the opposition unprepared or not able to come together. And I know it's very different opposition outlooks and ideologies in Turkey, but you see this in these societies trying to build strong and vibrant and transparent democracies. And when the opposition comes together, they tend to bicker as they're divided by the ruling party. And this is a they didn't do that badly, but they didn't perform as they should have. So this is a weakness of the opposition coming together.
Dilek Kurban, one party that profited from the dissatisfaction last June in the elections in June was the pro-Kurdish HDP party. Why was it not able to build on that gain that it had just 5 months ago?
Well, I mean, first, let's remember what this party has gone through in the past 5 months. I mean, one reason why the OSCE and also the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe had concluded that the elections were not fair was because of the harassment, the violence that HDP had experienced. They have
harassment by the government.
Well, harassment by the government, but also, yeah, I mean, because their
its offices were raided, people were arrested.
A number of elected mayors have been arrested, taken out of office, and of course, then there was this big bomb that was planted by IS in a rally, which included also HDP members. 102 people died. This happened just a few weeks before the elections. So this was, HDP operated in an extremely, sort of difficult conditions. So that's one thing. And the second is, of course, war started again between the PKK and the Turkish military. And that sort of made it very difficult for HDP to offer to be found credible by some of its electorates who had voted for it before as a peace alternative. On the other hand, let's not forget that HDP still succeeded to pass the threshold. They're still in the parliament, and now the third biggest party in the parliament. So one could say that they're still, they're not the big losers of the elections.
Interestingly enough, if one thinks back to the origins of the AK party and, of course, of Mr. Erdogan, he once stood for reform. The party's name itself, Law and Development, indicates how strong that commitment was, at least in name. The fact is, he wanted, at that time, a break with the old system of the deep state and its corrupt network of the military and political elites. But what does the AK party stand for today? Let's take a look at one set of arguments.
The AKP's victory at the polls won't lead to a dictatorship. Other countries also have systems with a strong president, like the one Erdogan envisions. Many Turks voted for his Islamist-rooted conservative party because it claims to stand for security and stability. Even in the Kurdish-majority city of Diyarbakir, the AKP took 7% of the ballots. Investors like stability. That's why the country's stock market and currency made gains after the election results were announced. Civil society could also profit from an economic upswing. With a stable majority behind him, Erdogan will likely seek to de-escalate the conflict with Kurdish nationalists and also keep a low profile in Syria. Turkish voters have made it clear that they aren't interested in any more military adventures.
Judy Dempsey, proponents of realpolitik say in such a volatile region that a trade-off between reform and security is just good common sense. Isn't there something to be said for that?
Well, many governments, many Western governments and democratic governments really do put stability before reform, thus essentially paying lip service to their own values. Actually, why can't you do both? Why can't you have realpolitik and why can't you have reform? And also, why can't you have a little mixture of conditionality as well? After all, with the situation of the Turkish economy and its very unstable neighbours and what's happening in the Middle East, shouldn't Turkey be looking to the European Union and these very wealthy countries in the European Union for investment, for confidence, for a kind of reforms? So I think there could be a trade-off. I don't think it's one or the other. It can be a balance.
Alan Posener, that report predicted that Mr. Erdogan would moderate his hard line once he was back in power and feeling secure. We're not seeing too many signs of that yet, are we?
Yeah, I don't see where that confidence comes from. I don't want to criticize our own video clip, but where do they? He says he's got a mandate for the policy he's been following up till now, it seems to me. So. Why would he? It seems to be a winning card. Why would he moderate himself? Also, it's not only in his own power. I mean, let's face it, the PKK, the Kurdish terrorist group, they attacked first. Erdogan only struck back. Let's face it, in Syria, Erdogan doesn't control events. He's reacting to events. So whatever he does is not only dependent on what he does. I mean, he's reacting to events possibly beyond his control. Putin intervening in Syria. Goodness knows what the PKK is going to do now. So I don't see any cause for optimism, not only because of what Erdogan might think or do, but because of what other actors are going to do.
Dilek Kurban, where do you see things going from here? Mr. Erdogan has said one thing he is definitely looking to do is change the constitution to strengthen the office of the presidency. His supporters say that's essential for economic growth.
May I just respond
Yeah.
very quickly? Just to note, certainly the PKK was to attack first, but this came after Erdogan personally announced that the peace process was over. It's the peace process that he had himself started. This was before the June elections. He really was very manipulative in the way in which he provoked sort of strong Kurdish reaction, not just from the PKK, but also from the HDP. Why? To appeal to nationalist votes, and it worked. A considerable amount of the 9% increase in the AKP votes comes from the MHP, which is the Turkish Nationalist Party. That is an old tactic, by the way, that Erdogan had time and again resorted, for example, in the 2004 local elections. This is not something new. He does it all the time. As for Syria, certainly he didn't start the war in Syria, but he and his government, AKP government, they were very clearly backing various opposition forces, including fundamentalist Islamists, some of which ended up in IS, etc. And let's not forget that this bombing that I mentioned earlier in Ankara, the names of the individuals who planted the bomb, their names were known to the general public months before. The police were apparently after them. And so to this government, the problem is that this government doesn't see IS as nearly a threat as the PKK. And this is their official policy. Coming back to your question, they do have the power to change the constitution, but they still need to submit it to the referendum. I don't think that in a referendum they would have a yes vote to change the regime to a presidential system, because that was the issue in the June elections. Having said that, they don't need it anymore. Erdogan also declared this in record that there is a de facto presidential system in Turkey, and we see the signs of that. We will see more signs of that.
Judy Dempsey, as I say, the supporters of Erdogan say, executive presidency, lots of countries have it. It's not the equivalent of a dictatorship. You're shaking your head violently there, but these are the arguments that are being made.
Fine.
And in fact, there are countries with strong presidencies that are by no means dictatorships.
Yes, and let us give examples of those countries with strong presidencies and not in particularly shining democracies. And do you see any economic reform with such a strong president, with such strong executive powers? The idea that a strong president can introduce economic reforms is a contradiction in terms. Economic reforms demand fresh air, liberalisation, transparency, openness, clear property rights, investor-friendly. Given the situation in Turkey, I cannot see President Erdogan guarantee this. However, if there's any silver lining in this, and I hope there is for the Turks and for the Turkish people, is this, that the worse the economy becomes, Erdogan he has no option but to look to genuine reforms. Otherwise, there'll be no foreign direct investment, which actually fed the Turkish economy. This is about investor confidence as well.
Alan Posener, you said in your opening statement that you believe Erdogan has no mandate to change the constitution, but that we have to rely on him. He's our most important partner. So hold our noses and just do the dirty deal? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, hold our noses. I mean, let's face it, Erdogan is not Putin. Erdogan is not Assad. Erdogan is not even al-Sisi in Egypt. Erdogan is someone who was elected in a free, not fair election, and he has the confidence of the majority of the Turkish people, and he's vitally important to solve the problem in Syria. He's vitally important for solving the refugee crisis or helping solve the refugee crisis. There's no alternative to doing business with him, and we shouldn't be too cagey about it. Let's go for it. With we can put conditionality, no problem with that, but let's face it, he's in a stronger position now than he was a month ago and a year ago and 2 years ago. Let's face up to that reality.
Then he should
let us take a brief look at what it is that the EU is expecting from Mr. Erdogan. It recently offered Turkey €3 billion in financial aid to keep some 2.2 million Syrian refugees on its own soil. Let's take a look.
Before the vote, it was clear that the European Union would prefer a strong AKP showing. Erdogan stands for stability and is a key player in the ongoing migrant crisis. German Chancellor Angela Merkel's visit to Turkey shortly before the elections enhanced the ruling party's status, indirectly providing its campaign with support. This despite the fact that regime critics and minorities in Turkey are still persecuted and arrested. An EU progress report rebukes Erdogan's government for that and other rights abuses, but it was only made public after the vote. Critics say in order not to hurt AKP chances at the polls. And suddenly, talks on Turkish accession to the EU are back on the table, although Merkel's Christian Democrats have always been against the idea. But Turkey no longer has to play the role of supplicant. In talks, it can now also dictate conditions.
Dilek Kurban, did Chancellor Merkel, in effect, help Mr. Erdogan with his campaign and possibly even with his victory by visiting him in Turkey 2 weeks before the election?
Well, absolutely. I mean, of course, we don't have an empirical data to able to measure the concrete impact on the votes. probably it was not that significant, but in terms of giving legitimacy to Erdogan, absolutely. And it's incredible that Merkel went against her own principles and well-established rules in Europe and the US, that you just don't go and visit a head of the state right before the elections.
But you heard what Alan Posener just said. We have to rely on Mr. Erdogan. We have to rely on Turkey. It may not be appealing. It may contravene some of our values, but it's all we have.
Well, I don't agree. It's just amazing. What happened to European values? Certainly, Turkey needs to. I mean, certainly they have to work with the Turkish government, obviously. But to see that that Erdogan is as he is with his policies, with this sort of anti-democratic stance, is the option is really insane. I think the Europeans and the German government are so panicked with having refugees here in Europe that they just want to basically send them back or keep them in Turkey at all costs, give the money, and sort of violate their own obligations under the Geneva Conventions for refugee protection. Forget about the principles, democratic principles that the EU supposedly stands for. Forget about the Copenhagen political criteria, and just sort of make everyone believe that this is the only option.
Judy Dempsey, your own opening statement said that the election result would move Turkey either away from Europe or closer to it. Clearly, from the discussion we've had here so far, most of you agree that probably this election result will move Turkey further away. Yet, it sounds from that report like the EU is ready to embrace Mr. Erdogan no matter how far away he moves.
What is the EU? And there's 28 member states there. And the biggest obstacle that actually stopped the EU coming closer to Turkey and opening up these negotiation chapters was Cyprus. Don't forget how important Cyprus is. If Erdogan had the political antennae, and I think he has maybe for this, he could actually make a deal over the divided island of Cyprus. This divided island has been going on far too long when the Turks invaded the northern part in 1974. Here's a chance, actually, for Erdogan for statesmanship. And if the Cyprus issue is resolved, Cyprus, as an EU member, can't continue to actually prevent the EU from opening these negotiations with Turkey. We're not talking about the EU, we're talking about some countries that do not want Turkey to be close to the EU. Chancellor Merkel plays a pivotal role in all of this.
Alan Posener, does the EU really have no leverage to push Turkey in regard to the treatment of the media, of the Kurds? Does the EU really need Turkey more than Turkey needs the EU?
Yes, the EU needs Turkey more than Turkey needs the EU. We had the chance a couple of years ago. We missed it because we are obsessed with the Greek crisis. And instead of using the Greek crisis to force the Greeks to cooperate, instead of using the Cyprus crisis, they had an economic crisis, to cooperate with the Turks. Yes. We let it all roll. And now we're reaping the results of Merkel's short-sightedness in this respect. We don't have much leverage. We need Turkey more than they need us. Sorry to say.
It's not one way. It's not a one-way street. Don't Turkey and the Turkish civil society, the Turkish opposition, but Turkey needs Europe as well. Look what's happening in Azerbaijan. Relations have completely soured. Look at the region that Turkey finds itself in. Where is the region of stability? It is Europe. Frankly, Turkish business, the Turkish diaspora in Europe, they need each other. It's not. It's a reciprocal relationship that could be exploited by both sides.
Dilek Kurban, very briefly, back to this deal that the EU has been making with Turkey. If it, in fact, subcontracts the task of holding back migrants, keeping them on Turkish soil, what kind of treatment can the migrants expect in Turkey?
Well, first of all, let's not forget that they don't have refugee status. Turkey has a reservation, geographical reservation to the Geneva Convention. It just doesn't accept anybody who comes from east of Turkey as refugees. These people at best have guest status. They cannot work. They cannot access education. What awaits them is what they've been living for 4 years: discrimination, extreme poverty, begging on the streets, and with no prospect of future. I hope that at least the EU and Angela Merkel would be, I'm going to say, humane enough to at least impose on Turkey to change its refugee policies and offer a future for these people, and not make the mistake of declaring Turkey a safe state, where just a week ago 2 Syrian activists were beheaded by IS in Urfa in Turkey.
Alan Posener is telling us the EU doesn't have leverage. It's not going to be able to drive that kind of a bargain. Would you agree?
Well, certainly it does. Otherwise, why would Erdogan care so much to post with America? He does care about his prestige, after all.
Judy Dempsey, our title, Mandate for an Autocrat. Was that what that election was?
No. It was a mandate for risk. And Erdogan has to choose which side he's going to jump.
Okay. Thank you very much to all of you for being with us today, and thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon.